On a crisp morning, Sarah Williams stepped into the bustling airport with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Today marked the beginning of a much-needed vacation. After months of non-stop work in her high-powered corporate role, she had earned herself a first-class ticket to Paris. The airport was alive with chatter and the low hum of rolling suitcases. As she navigated through the terminal, her heels clicking against the polished floors, she couldn't help but smile. This was the moment she had been working towards, her hard-earned promotion, the recognition from her team, and now this, a first-class seat to the City of Lights. She felt accomplished, proud, and ready to embrace the escape from the relentless pace of her life. The line at security had been swift, the wait to board short, and the friendly smiles of the flight attendants gave Sarah a sense of relief. She had worked so hard, and now, it seemed like everything was falling into place. She passed through the gate, the anticipation building. The idea of luxury, the wide leather seats, the gourmet meals, the privacy, was a distant fantasy she'd always envied from afar, and now, it was her reality. She scanned her boarding pass for the last time, ensuring everything was in order before stepping onto the jet bridge. The narrow hallway seemed to stretch forever, but every step forward felt like the culmination of years of ambition. As she reached the aircraft door, the flight attendant greeted her with a polite smile, taking her boarding pass. "First class, ma'am?" she asked with a quick scan of the document. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady, a little pride creeping into her tone. She followed the attendant down the narrow aisle, past rows of seats filled with other passengers who would settle for economy or business class. She could feel their eyes on her, curiosity, envy, even a hint of judgment, but she didn't care. She had earned this seat. As the attendant led her to the front of the plane, Sarah couldn't suppress the grin that tugged at the corners of her mouth. The first-class cabin felt like a dream, spacious, elegant, and intimate. Plush leather seats stretched out in all directions, offering a world of comfort and quiet luxury. The soft hum of the engine and the distant chatter of other passengers made the space feel like an oasis. She sank into her seat, adjusting the armrests and settling in. The stewardess handed her a glass of champagne with a soft smile, and Sarah felt a wave of gratitude. This was the kind of experience she had only heard about in stories, and now she was living it. She looked out of the window, admiring the busy runway as the plane began to taxi. The world was her oyster. In her mind, she visualized herself walking into a Parisian café, sipping espresso, surrounded by the charm of the city. Her mind wandered to the possibilities of what this trip could bring, time to unwind, to reflect, to dream. But just as she was beginning to settle into her thoughts, something felt off. The energy in the cabin had shifted, and a sense of unease began to prick at her. Sarah noticed a man in a pilot's uniform, a flight captain, moving towards her. He wasn't walking with the usual calm of someone about to take the helm of an aircraft. He seemed tense, his movements sharp and purposeful. He stopped in front of her seat, his face unreadable. Sarah furrowed her brow, wondering what was happening. Had there been an issue with her seat? Maybe she hadn't heard the announcement clearly. Her heart rate increased ever so slightly as she braced herself for whatever this conversation might bring. "Excuse me, ma'am," the pilot said, his voice authoritative, yet tinged with something she couldn't quite place, discomfort. "There's been a mistake with your seating arrangement. I'm afraid you'll have to move." Sarah blinked, not fully processing what he was saying. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, her voice steady but her confusion palpable. "This is a first-class seat, ma'am," he said, his tone not quite as polite as it had been. "There was an error in the system. You're not authorized to be here." Sarah's mind raced. She double-checked her boarding pass in her hand, and sure enough, it showed the first-class seating arrangement. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said, keeping her tone calm, though she could feel a knot tightening in her stomach. "I have a first-class ticket, and I'm sure everything is fine." Her fingers gripped the armrest as she tried to read his face for any hint of the issue. "No, I'm afraid it's not fine," the pilot replied, his gaze hardening. He glanced over his shoulder as if to see if anyone else in the cabin might be watching. He gestured toward the flight attendant, who was standing behind him, her face unreadable. "Ma'am, if you would just come with me, we can sort this out," the flight attendant added, her voice low, almost apologetic, but there was a note of finality that made Sarah's heart race. Sarah remained seated, her hands now gripping the edge of the seat. "I don't understand. This is my seat, as confirmed by my boarding pass," she said, trying to remain calm. "Is this some kind of mistake?" The pilot's face was impassive. "We've had a seating issue come up," he said, though Sarah could hear the slight edge in his voice. "I'm asking you to move." His gaze didn't soften, nor did the flight attendant step in to reassure her. It was as if they were both silently waiting for her to comply. There was a beat of silence, the tension thickening between them. Sarah's mind raced. Something wasn't right. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some were already whispering, glancing toward the unfolding scene. Others were trying to ignore the discomfort. Sarah could sense a judgment in the air, but she wasn't sure from whom. Why was this happening? She was simply a paying customer, with a confirmed seat. She wasn't an inconvenience. She wasn't trouble. She hadn't done anything wrong. The weight of the moment settled into her chest, and she could feel her resolve hardening. The flight attendant repeated the pilot's demand, this time more forcefully, her voice rising just slightly as if trying to push Sarah into submission. But Sarah remained still, her mind set on one thing: she was not going to be intimidated. She had worked too hard for this moment, and she was not going to be forced to back down. "I'm not moving," Sarah said, her voice firm now, no longer just confused but tinged with the beginnings of anger. "I have a valid ticket. You can check it if you'd like. But I'm not leaving." The pilot's eyes narrowed. "I don't think you understand, ma'am," he said, stepping even closer. His voice dropped, becoming colder, almost as if he were trying to force his authority into the space. "You are not supposed to be in first class. If you don't comply, we will have to call security." The words hit Sarah like a slap, but her resolve only hardened. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. This was about something deeper, something she couldn't yet name, but she knew it when she felt it. She wasn't going to be intimidated, and she wasn't going to let her dignity be stripped away so easily. She stared back at the pilot, refusing to blink. "Call whoever you want," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I'm staying right here." The tension hung in the air as she glanced around at the other passengers, some still watching, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few were whispering among themselves, but no one spoke out. Sarah was alone in this, she knew it. This wasn't just about a first-class seat. It was about something much larger, something she hadn't yet fully realized. And as the minutes ticked by, she knew her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet predict. What she didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The moment that would change everything had just begun to unfold. And what happened next would shock everyone on that plane, and perhaps even Sarah herself. The tension in the cabin grew palpable. Every second that passed seemed to stretch, the air thick with anticipation and discomfort. The pilot stood there, glaring at Sarah, and the flight attendant lingered just behind him, her face a mask of neutrality. Around them, the passengers had gone quiet. The usual hum of conversation had faded, replaced by the subtle, uncomfortable sounds of shuffling in seats, the soft rustle of clothes, and the occasional cough. Sarah's hands were still tightly gripping the armrests, but her mind was racing. She couldn't believe what was happening. She had been treated with nothing but respect up until now. She had been polite, composed, and prepared for the smooth, luxurious journey ahead. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. It was as if her presence was now something that needed to be questioned, scrutinized, dismissed. She couldn't help but wonder if her appearance, if her skin, had something to do with this sudden escalation. A slight flicker of doubt passed through her mind, but she quickly pushed it aside. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her into leaving her seat. The pilot cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Ma'am, we don't have time for this. You need to move. We're holding up the entire flight." "Why?" Sarah's voice shook with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Why do I need to move? What's the actual issue here?" She stood her ground, refusing to let the rising panic take hold. She had done everything right. She had followed all the rules. She had a first-class seat. She had earned this, and no one was going to take it from her without an explanation. "We're asking you nicely," the pilot said, his tone growing more authoritative with each word. "This is a serious matter, and you're making it worse." Sarah couldn't help but notice the dismissive way he spoke to her, as if she were a child being scolded. The calm, collected persona she had built over years of dealing with difficult situations began to crack. A surge of frustration bubbled up inside her, threatening to overtake her. "I've already told you," Sarah said, her voice firming. "This is my seat, and I'm not moving." For a long moment, the flight attendant said nothing, simply observing the exchange between Sarah and the pilot. Then, as if on cue, she turned and began to walk down the aisle toward the cockpit. Sarah couldn't help but watch her go, feeling the weight of the woman's departure. The flight attendant had been silent during most of this confrontation, yet something about her sudden retreat left Sarah feeling more isolated than ever. Was she going to get help? Was she just following orders, or did she have some role in this bizarre interaction? As the flight attendant disappeared behind the curtains to the cockpit, Sarah's attention snapped back to the pilot, who was now standing even closer, his face rigid with authority. His eyes locked on hers, and Sarah felt the weight of his gaze, as though he was silently daring her to back down. But she wouldn't. She refused to. She had every right to be in that seat. "Security will be called," he threatened, his voice low and steady. "And you don't want to make this worse. If you don't move, you'll be removed from the flight. It's that simple." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Sarah's mind whirled, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. Her heart beat faster, her thoughts clouded with confusion and disbelief. She had never been in a situation like this before, no confrontation like this, no threat that made her question her very right to exist in a space she had paid for. The cold reality of the pilot's words settled into her gut, and for the first time since boarding, Sarah felt like a stranger in her own world. But then something shifted in her. The seed of doubt, that brief flicker of uncertainty, began to grow into something else, a quiet, fierce determination. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about standing up for herself, about refusing to be pushed around. This was about dignity, about proving that no one had the right to strip her of what she had earned. "I don't care who you call," Sarah replied, her voice low but unwavering. "You're not taking my seat from me." Her gaze locked with his, and she saw the slightest flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by irritation. He hadn't expected this response. He had expected fear, compliance, someone who would cower under the pressure. But Sarah wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of that. The pilot looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Sarah held her ground, her jaw clenched and her back straight. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her now, some watching with silent judgment, others with barely concealed curiosity. Sarah could almost feel the weight of their thoughts pressing down on her. Some were likely hoping she would just give in, hoping for the drama to end quickly so they could enjoy their flight. But Sarah was resolute. This was not going to end with her backing down. A moment later, the flight attendant returned, this time accompanied by a second, uniformed member of the cabin crew. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his presence commanding the space. He walked over to Sarah's seat with a sense of purpose, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of weakness. The pilot stepped back, and the two crew members exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. "We need you to step aside," the tall crew member said in a firm, no-nonsense tone. He didn't even acknowledge Sarah's protest or question. He didn't need to. He was here to enforce the decision. "Come with us now." Sarah could feel the familiar sting of her resolve slipping away. The pressure of the moment, the fact that no one seemed to understand or care, was starting to wear on her. The cabin was eerily silent now, every pair of eyes on her, waiting for her to make the next move. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. But she wasn't going to give in. Not this time. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice rising slightly, though still controlled. "You're making a mistake. This is my seat." The tall crew member's expression faltered for a moment. His posture stiffened, and his eyes flicked to the pilot, who now looked like he was considering a new course of action. The tension between the three of them hung thick in the air, charged with uncertainty and unease. "We don't want to escalate this any further," the tall crew member said, his voice softened just slightly. He took a step closer to Sarah, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you're causing a disruption. If you don't leave your seat, we will have to remove you from the flight." For the first time since this whole ordeal had started, Sarah felt a flash of panic. Could they really do that? Could they force her off the plane? She had no idea. But she wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. Something deep inside her told her this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. There was something else at play here, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but she knew she had to stand her ground. With a final, defiant look at the crew, Sarah took a deep breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wasn't moving. She had paid for this seat. She had earned her place in that first-class cabin. No one was going to take that from her. And that's when it happened. The moment that would forever change everything. The flight attendant, who had been standing silently in the background, stepped forward again, this time with a different look in her eyes. It wasn't just duty she carried now. It was something else. Something that would shock Sarah to her core. The flight attendant, now standing a few feet from Sarah, was different than before. Her face, once neutral, was now tinged with something more serious, even urgent. She took a deep breath, her eyes momentarily scanning the faces of the other passengers, as if silently calculating the moment's gravity. Then, without warning, she spoke again, this time in a voice that was far softer than before, as if she were attempting to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, we really don't want this to escalate further. You're disrupting the flight, and we're asking you for the last time to please vacate your seat." For a split second, Sarah considered complying, but the words felt like a command that threatened to strip her of everything she had earned. Why was she being singled out? She had traveled frequently, and in all her years of flying, she had never been treated this way. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was something personal, something beneath the surface that Sarah couldn't ignore. She looked around the cabin, at the faces of the other passengers who had been watching. Some of them were still holding their breath, as if waiting for her to crumble. Others were already shaking their heads, their discomfort visible in the slight tensing of their shoulders. And then, there were those few, silent, observing, unsure whether to join in the condemnation or step up to challenge the situation. The cabin felt like a battlefield, each passenger silently choosing sides. But Sarah couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. She had to make a decision that would affect everything from here on out. The pilot and the flight attendant were holding their ground, but she had one card left to play. Sarah's gaze fixed on the woman in front of her, her stance unwavering. "You're wrong," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "This is my seat, and you don't have the right to take it from me. I'm not going anywhere." The tension between them escalated. The flight attendant's face hardened, but there was something in her eyes, a flash of recognition, of realization. Sarah could see it, even if the flight attendant quickly masked it with a stern expression. Whatever she had been expecting, it wasn't this. Sarah wasn't just another passenger who would fold under pressure. She wasn't going to be silenced. "Ma'am, please," the flight attendant began again, but before she could continue, the tall crew member, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward. His presence was intimidating, and his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the situation. But something had changed, his posture wasn't as commanding anymore. The air had shifted. Sarah could feel it. "Let's not make this worse than it needs to be," the tall crew member said, his voice now almost pleading, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his tone. "We just want to make sure everything goes smoothly, but you're not helping the situation." Sarah stood firm, refusing to back down, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, without warning, something unexpected happened. The flight attendant, who had been so quick to demand compliance, seemed to hesitate. She looked around at the other passengers once more, and then, her gaze landed back on Sarah. It was as though she were seeing Sarah for the first time, not just as a passenger, but as an individual. The realization hit Sarah like a wave. The woman in front of her wasn't just an employee of the airline, she was a person who had been placed in an impossible situation. And Sarah wasn't the only one who felt the weight of it. The passengers around them were watching, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others keeping a cautious eye on what would happen next. The flight attendant's next words stunned Sarah. "I can't do this," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. She took another step forward, closer to Sarah, and for a moment, there was no one else in the world. It was just the two of them, locked in a silent, shared understanding. "I can't be a part of this," she repeated, almost whispering. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What was happening? The moment felt surreal. Was the flight attendant finally seeing the injustice of the situation? Was she questioning what she had been asked to do? But before Sarah could process the thought, the flight attendant took another step back, her eyes now darting between Sarah and the other crew member. The tall man, who had been silent for a moment, suddenly spoke up. "You need to get her out of the seat. Now." There was a finality in his voice that made the whole situation feel like a train barreling toward them with no brakes. The tension in the air thickened. But it wasn't just Sarah who felt it, it was everyone in the cabin. A low murmur passed through the passengers, as if they too were beginning to realize that something much bigger was at play here. The flight attendant looked at the tall crew member, then back to Sarah. She took one last breath. And spoke the words that would forever change everything. "I'm sorry, ma'am. But I can't do this anymore." And with that, she turned and walked down the aisle, leaving Sarah stunned and momentarily speechless. The tall crew member's face twisted with disbelief. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered under his breath, too quiet for Sarah to hear, but loud enough for the passengers nearby to catch. His hands balled into fists, and he took a step toward Sarah, as if preparing to force her out of the seat. But before he could make another move, the flight attendant's voice rang out again, now from the front of the plane. "Call the captain," she said, her tone firm, but laced with an undeniable note of finality. "I'm not doing this. This is wrong." The tall crew member turned, clearly caught off guard, but the flight attendant's words had already set something in motion that couldn't be undone. The room was changing. The energy in the cabin was palpable, thick with the sense that everything had just shifted. Sarah, still in her seat, was now the center of attention, but not just from the crew, there was a change in the passengers as well. A subtle but powerful undercurrent of solidarity was forming, quiet but unmistakable. The captain's voice finally crackled through the intercom, calm and authoritative. "Attention, everyone," he said, the words drawing everyone's attention. "We're addressing a situation on board. Please remain in your seats and remain calm." The moment the words left the captain's mouth, everything seemed to fall into place. The other passengers, who had been quiet throughout the entire confrontation, suddenly felt emboldened. Their whispers grew louder, and Sarah could hear snippets of their conversations. Some were speaking in hushed tones, unsure of what to make of the situation. Others were murmuring with concern, some with frustration. But Sarah, despite the chaos, knew that she had just crossed an invisible line. Something had changed. This was no longer just about a seat. It was about something much deeper, a battle for respect, for her dignity, for her right to stand firm in the face of injustice. She had seen the hesitation in the flight attendant's eyes. She had witnessed the crew's internal conflict. And now, Sarah knew that she was not alone in this fight. She wasn't just a woman in a seat anymore, she was a symbol of something much larger. As the minutes passed, the situation seemed to grow more urgent. The passengers around Sarah were beginning to realize that the outcome of this confrontation could have lasting implications. Some had started to look at her differently, no longer just as a passenger, but as someone who had made a stand. A few exchanged glances, as if silently deciding which side they would take. The other flight attendants remained silent, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. And then, the door to the cockpit opened, and the captain stepped onto the floor of the cabin. He was a tall man with a stern face, his uniform pristine, his posture straight and unyielding. His eyes swept the cabin quickly, taking in the tense atmosphere before landing on Sarah. And for the first time, Sarah could feel the weight of all their gazes upon her, not just the crew, but the passengers as well. She had become the focal point, the catalyst that was sparking something larger. "Ma'am," the captain said in a voice that was calm but firm, "I understand there's been some confusion regarding your seat. Let's get this sorted out." He looked briefly at the flight attendant, who nodded back, her face pale. Sarah's heart raced, but she remained calm. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she was determined to see this through. She wasn't backing down now. The captain turned to the tall crew member, who was still standing nearby. "Get the passenger list," he ordered. The crew member nodded, but the uncertainty was clear in his eyes. Sarah's heart pounded as she waited for the next move. The tall crew member hurried to the front of the cabin, his footsteps echoing as he went. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. The passengers around Sarah sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama, some of them visibly uncomfortable, others leaning forward, eager to see what would happen next. Sarah, still seated, was acutely aware of the eyes on her, but she refused to be intimidated. She had come this far, and she wasn't backing down now. The captain's approach had only made her more resolute, there was no turning back. As the crew member returned with the passenger list, his face was grim. He handed it to the captain, who examined it briefly before his eyes flicked toward Sarah. She could feel his gaze, steady and unyielding. He was sizing her up, trying to gauge how to handle the situation, but she wasn't going to make it easy for him. She knew that whatever came next, it would set the course for everything that followed. "Ma'am," the captain said, his voice low but firm, "it appears that there has been a misunderstanding. The seat you're in was mistakenly assigned to another passenger." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "However, we can resolve this without any further disruption. We can move you to another seat, one in economy class." Sarah didn't flinch, though the offer was tempting. Her eyes locked with his, unwavering. The offer was an easy out for them, but it didn't solve the real issue. It didn't address the reason she had been singled out in the first place. "No," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This is my seat, and I'm not moving. You're not going to make me leave." The captain's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He seemed momentarily caught off guard by Sarah's refusal. The flight attendants behind him exchanged looks, clearly unsure of how to proceed. It was becoming evident that Sarah was not the passive passenger they had hoped for. She was not only standing her ground, she was demanding respect. "I understand your position," the captain said, his voice now laced with a touch of frustration. "But you have to understand that there are rules. The airline has procedures, and this is how things are done. We can't allow passengers to remain in seats that don't belong to them." Sarah could hear the implication in his words, the underlying assumption that she was somehow at fault, that her insistence was an inconvenience. The indignity of it all began to wear on her, but she refused to let it show. She had worked too hard, earned her seat, and refused to let anyone strip her of her dignity. "I don't care about your procedures," Sarah replied, her tone sharp but controlled. "This is about more than just a seat. You don't get to decide who belongs here. I belong here. I've paid for this seat, and I'm not leaving until I'm ready." The captain was momentarily speechless. His hands clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. The flight attendants behind him shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this situation was spiraling out of their control. The other passengers, too, were beginning to react. Whispers rippled through the cabin, and Sarah could hear the murmurs of support, quiet but unmistakable. Some passengers, likely witnesses to the injustice, were starting to voice their opinions. "She's right," one man said from the back of the plane, his voice rising above the hushed murmurs. "That's her seat. She shouldn't have to move." The captain's eyes flicked toward the back of the cabin, where the voice had come from, but he didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he turned back to Sarah, a look of steely resolve returning to his face. "If you don't vacate the seat, we will have no choice but to call security," he said, his words now more pointed. The threat hung in the air, but Sarah didn't flinch. If anything, the mention of security only steeled her resolve. She wasn't going anywhere. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about standing up for herself, for her rights, and for the principles of fairness and justice. She could feel the weight of the situation, the importance of what was at stake. If she gave in now, if she let them push her out of her rightful place, what message would that send? As the captain and flight attendants exchanged a few more hushed words, Sarah glanced around the cabin once more. The murmurs were growing louder now. More and more passengers were openly expressing their support. "Let her stay," one woman called out. "It's her seat. You don't have the right to move her." Another man nodded in agreement, his voice unwavering. "If they make her leave, it's not right. We're all watching." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted again. What had started as an isolated confrontation between Sarah and the crew was now a larger issue, one that the passengers were beginning to rally behind. Sarah realized, with a shock, that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all of them. All of the passengers who had ever felt overlooked or disrespected, who had ever been made to feel small or invisible. They were standing with her now, not just because they recognized the injustice, but because they saw the broader message she was sending. The captain, sensing the rising tension, took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control, and the last thing he wanted was a public spectacle that could escalate further. "All right, ma'am," he said, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. "If you refuse to move, we will have to take further action. But I hope you understand that we are simply trying to keep things civil and avoid any disruptions." Sarah's heart raced, but she stood firm. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The flight attendants, too, were silent now, unsure of what to do. It was clear that the crew was out of their depth. The authority they had relied on had begun to crumble under the weight of the collective will of the passengers. "I understand," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken resolve. "But I'm not moving." For a moment, the captain and the crew were silent, weighing their next move. Then, almost as if they had come to a mutual understanding, the captain nodded curtly. "Very well," he said. "We'll make sure your situation is resolved." But Sarah wasn't done yet. She had one final move to make, one that would not only solidify her position but force the airline to acknowledge the depth of their mistake. As the captain turned to walk away, Sarah stood up from her seat, her movements deliberate and measured. The crew looked on, unsure of what she was doing, but Sarah was clear on her intentions. She made her way to the front of the plane, past the flight attendants who stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah approached the cockpit door, where the captain had just disappeared, and knocked. There was a pause before the door swung open, revealing the captain standing just inside. "I'm not done here," Sarah said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I want to speak with the airline's management. Now." The captain's face darkened, but he could see that Sarah was not going to relent. This was no longer just about the seat. It was about making a statement, a demand for accountability. And he realized, as he looked into her eyes, that this was one battle he wasn't going to win. The captain stepped aside, allowing Sarah to pass. As she entered the cockpit, she knew that the consequences of this moment would reach far beyond this flight. And as the door closed behind her, the fate of the situation hung in the as Sarah entered the cockpit, the door clicked shut behind her with an audible finality. The space was small and confined, the hum of the aircraft's engine vibrating through the walls. The captain, standing by the controls, looked at her with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment. Every decision, every action, every word had led her to this point. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore, she was standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or insignificant. This was bigger than a seat. This was about dignity, respect, and the courage to face an unjust system head-on. The captain's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing at first. Instead, he glanced at the co-pilot, who was staring out the window, nervously tapping his fingers on the controls. The silence in the cockpit was palpable, broken only by the soft whir of the instruments. Sarah stood firm, her back straight, her mind racing but her resolve unshaken. She was not leaving until her voice had been heard, and she knew it was time for the airline to face the consequences of their actions. Finally, the captain spoke, his voice low but sharp. "You're out of line," he said, his tone biting. "This is not the place for personal grievances. You need to return to your seat. Now." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. She could feel her pulse quickening, but her resolve remained intact. She had come this far, and she wasn't backing down. "I'm not leaving until I speak with someone who can fix this," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I've been disrespected, and it's time for you to fix that. You need to call someone higher up, someone who can actually make things right." The captain's eyes flicked to the cockpit's small intercom system, then back to Sarah. He hesitated, clearly weighing his options. He could try to push her out, call security, or continue to resist, but the truth was, the situation was beyond his control now. Passengers were watching. People were talking. There was no turning back. If he made the wrong move, it could escalate further, something he didn't want, especially mid-flight. "I'm calling the head of customer service," the captain said through gritted teeth, his tone laced with frustration. He reached for the intercom and pressed the button. His voice came through the speakers, loud and clear, but it wasn't the authority he had hoped for. It sounded strained, almost balance. "Flight 704 to Denver, requesting assistance from customer service immediately. We have a situation that needs resolution." The captain's words lingered in the air, and for a moment, there was only silence. Sarah could feel the tension mounting. Outside the cockpit window, the clouds stretched out like an endless sea, the plane soaring through the sky, unaware of the drama unfolding in its interior. She knew the impact of this moment would echo far beyond this plane, far beyond the airline, and perhaps even far beyond the passengers on board. A few minutes later, the voice of a woman came through the intercom, crackling slightly. "This is Angela from customer service. I've been briefed on the situation." "What's going on, Captain?" The captain hesitated for a moment before answering. "We have a passenger refusing to vacate her seat in first class. She insists it is her assigned seat, but there's confusion regarding the assignment." Angela's voice came through the speaker, her tone surprisingly calm, almost detached. "Please clarify, Captain. Is she causing a disturbance?" The captain glanced at Sarah, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "No. She's not causing a disturbance. But this situation has escalated beyond my control. We need someone with the authority to resolve this now." Sarah could hear the undercurrent of tension in the captain's voice, and she took a small step forward. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said, her voice carrying through the cockpit speakers. "I'm asking for respect. You didn't just make a mistake with my seat, you made a mistake by assuming that I would just quietly accept it. That's the problem." Angela's voice crackled back through the intercom. "Captain, please follow protocol and have the passenger return to her assigned seat. We will resolve the issue when you land." But Sarah could feel the weight of the situation shifting. This was no longer just about following protocol. It was about power, who had it, who didn't, and how far people were willing to go to stand up for what was right. She took another step forward, feeling the heat of the moment. "No," she said again, this time louder, more insistent. "I'm not returning to my seat. You can't just sweep this under the rug. You can't make me disappear. This is wrong, and I'm not leaving until you make it right." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence on the intercom. Then, Angela's voice came through, her tone no longer detached but now tinged with something else, something that suggested she had finally understood the gravity of the situation. "I'll send someone to meet you at the gate," she said quietly. "But this isn't over." The tension in the cockpit was palpable as the captain stared at Sarah, his jaw clenched. He knew that he had lost control of the situation, that this was spiraling beyond anything he could have imagined. The passengers, the other crew members, and now customer service all knew about the incident. This wasn't going away quietly. But even as the captain opened the door to the cockpit and gestured for Sarah to step out, she knew that this battle was far from over. This wasn't about a seat anymore, it was about accountability. It was about a system that was broken, one that allowed people like her to be overlooked, disrespected, and ignored. The fact that she was standing here, refusing to back down, was a small but crucial victory in a much larger fight for dignity and respect. As Sarah walked back into the cabin, the passengers looked up, their eyes filled with anticipation. The whispers had grown louder now, a unified murmur of support. Some of the faces were familiar, others were strangers, but they all had one thing in common: they saw what was happening, and they were with her. The flight attendants, still shaken by what had transpired, barely made eye contact as Sarah passed them. They were no longer the authority figures they had once been. They were just people, trying to navigate a difficult situation. Sarah returned to her seat, but she didn't sit down immediately. She stood there for a moment, taking in the full weight of what had happened. She had stood her ground, refused to be pushed aside, and forced the system to recognize her humanity. As the plane continued on its course, a quiet sense of solidarity rippled through the cabin. The murmurs of support were still there, but they were no longer whispers. They were voices speaking up for fairness, for justice, for respect. The crew may have been defeated for now, but Sarah knew that this moment was far from over. And as the plane descended toward its destination, she felt a sense of empowerment, a sense of victory that would stay with her long after she left the plane. As the plane finally touched down on the tarmac in Denver, the tension that had been hanging in the air for the entire flight slowly began to dissipate. The wheels squealed against the runway, the engines humming as they powered down, and the captain's voice echoed over the intercom announcing the arrival. For most of the passengers, the journey would end with a routine disembarkation. But for Sarah, the fight was just beginning. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, taking a deep breath as the captain's voice echoed over the speakers one last time, urging everyone to remain seated until the plane had fully stopped. Her mind was racing, replaying the events over and over again. Despite the turbulence of the past few hours, she felt a strange sense of calm washing over her. She had made her stand, refused to back down, and had done what she knew was right. But the consequences of her actions were still unclear, and she had no idea how this would unfold once they were on the ground. As the plane came to a complete stop, the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign illuminated. Passengers slowly started to gather their things, some already pulling out their phones to check messages, while others stretched and yawned, ready to disembark. But Sarah stayed in her seat, her eyes scanning the cabin, wondering what would happen next. She could feel the weight of every gaze, but instead of shame, she held her head high. The flight attendants began their usual routine of directing passengers to the exit, but Sarah's focus was on the door to the front of the cabin. The moment it opened, she knew the confrontation would begin. She wasn't sure who would be waiting for her, but she wasn't afraid. No matter how this played out, she had already done what she needed to do. When the door to the cabin finally opened, Sarah stepped into the aisle. A group of airport security officers was waiting just outside the gate, their stern faces giving nothing away. At the sight of Sarah, they immediately took a step forward, and one of them, a tall man in a dark uniform, approached her. "Are you the passenger who was involved in the disturbance?" he asked in a no-nonsense tone. Sarah looked him in the eye, her heart beating steadily. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice steady. "I was the one who had an issue with my seat assignment." The officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to the flight attendants who had been standing in the doorway. They seemed to be waiting for him to take the lead, their expressions a mix of relief and uncertainty. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her focus on the officer in front of her. "Do you know why you were called back here?" the officer asked, his tone softer now, though no less authoritative. "I do," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I was disrespected when I was told my first-class seat wasn't mine. The pilot refused to honor the ticket I had purchased, and I wasn't going to just accept that. I made sure to speak to the right people, and now I'm waiting for them to make things right." The officer nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He motioned for another officer, a woman standing nearby, to approach. She stepped forward, holding a phone in her hand, and handed it to the officer. "We've been in contact with the airline," the officer said, glancing at the phone before looking back at Sarah. "They've informed us that they'll be meeting you shortly. They'll take it from here." The air felt thick with the weight of those words. Sarah could tell that the situation was far from over, but she also knew that this was just another step in the long process of holding people accountable for their actions. She nodded in acknowledgement, giving the officer a small, confident smile. "I'll be waiting," she said. "But I won't be going anywhere until I've spoken to someone with the authority to resolve this." The officers didn't say another word, but they stepped back, allowing Sarah to move toward the terminal entrance. As she walked, the murmurs of passengers who had already disembarked followed her, some curious, some supportive. She could feel their eyes on her, but instead of shrinking from their attention, she stood a little taller, a little prouder. What she had done was not easy, but it had been necessary. When she reached the gate, a woman in a suit was waiting for her. She was tall, with dark hair pulled tightly back into a bun, and her expression was serious. Sarah immediately recognized her as someone in a position of authority, likely a high-ranking official within the airline. The woman extended her hand, but Sarah didn't take it right away. She had learned over the past few hours that action spoke louder than words, and she was ready to see how the airline would respond. "I'm Sarah," she said after a beat, her voice calm but firm. "And I'm not leaving until you resolve this." The woman nodded, taking a step back. "I've been briefed on the situation, Sarah. I understand the circumstances, and I want to make sure we address this properly. I've already spoken with the captain, and we're reviewing the incident with the crew." "You need to do more than review it," Sarah replied, her voice rising slightly. "You need to make sure this never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone." The woman's expression softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I understand," she said quietly. "I will make sure this is addressed immediately. We'll take care of everything. This will be investigated fully." Sarah met her gaze, her own expression unwavering. "I don't want just an investigation," she said. "I want accountability. I want consequences for the people who allowed this to happen. They need to know that this behavior won't be tolerated. Not now, not ever." The woman took a deep breath and nodded. "I will ensure that your concerns are heard, and I'll follow up with you personally once we've completed our investigation." Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation lifting slightly. She hadn't gotten a guarantee yet, but she knew that this was the first step toward making things right. She had fought, not just for herself, but for anyone who had been made to feel invisible, disrespected, or forgotten. This fight was bigger than a single flight, a single seat. It was about standing up for what was right. As the woman walked away to handle the next steps, Sarah stood in the terminal, breathing deeply. There were still many questions left unanswered, but she knew she had done the right thing. This wasn't just about the wrong that had been done to her, it was about the system that had allowed it to happen in the first place. And as she walked away from the gate, heading toward the exit, Sarah knew that her voice had been heard. And that was enough for now. But the story wasn't over. In the days that followed, the airline was forced to address the incident publicly. It became a news story, one that sparked conversations across the country about race, privilege, and the responsibility of businesses to treat their customers with respect. The ripple effect of Sarah's actions spread far beyond that single flight, and the change she had started was only just beginning. She had opened a door, one that could not easily be closed again. And for Sarah, that was the true victory. She had done more than just stand up for herself. She had sparked a conversation, a movement, and, in the process, changed the way an entire community thought about fairness, dignity, and respect. The consequences of her actions were profound, and she knew that the world she had stepped into was not the same as the one she had left behind. She had fought for something bigger than herself. And, in the end, that was the most powerful thing she could have done.